Alright, well, it's St. Patrick's Day, March 17th, and we're going to hike into Rock Lake here along an old rail grade, as you can see here, converted to a trail. We're going to take a look at some ponderosa pine woodland. You can see some right here, definitely experiencing the effects of fire suppression, whereby we have a lot of regeneration of pines that is not subsequently thinned out by fire, and you wind up with a much more fire-prone stand that is susceptible to high severity fire, and that would lead to a stand regeneration event, and it would probably be fairly difficult to regenerate the stand after that, ironically. So definitely some major land use driven changes in potential fire behavior, in the fuel load, and in forest health. We'd probably have a lot of Ips pinei, which is the pine engraver, working on these dry woodlands. And the problem with fire suppression is that by allowing a much higher stand stocking level, as you can see here, it basically takes the stand out of balance with the available moisture. If it were a more open stand with a grassy understory and widely scattered large trees, that's more in balance with the available moisture supply year to year. But in this case, when we have a lot of competition for the moisture, that reduces the vigor of the trees, and we start to see more activity by insects like the pine engraver, Ips pinei. And if you don't manage your stocking, the beetles are going to do it for you, as one of my mentors likes to say. So just something that really is clearly evident right here as we hike into this landscape. All right, that's it for now. Check back in. We're starting to get down to the canyons where the Ice Age floods, the Pleistocene outburst floods, carved out a number of canyons, part of the greater channeled scablands complex. So where we have thin soils, a lot of plants that can do well on very thin soils, very rocky substrates, and we also have a lot of wetlands and lakes that were left in the wake of those Pleistocene floods. So you can see some of that here. Here's Jill by a derailed train car. I guess the railroad era was a little risky at times. Gotta watch your speed around these curves, I guess. Yeah, that was probably part of a pretty bad wreck if it's hanging off into the canyon like that. So this is the edge of the road cut for the old rail bed, and you can see that there's really not much soil sitting on top of the basalt rock. And we've got some gray rabbit brush there, Ericameria nauseosus. And we've also got some of our blue bunch wheatgrass, which you all remember from class. Our Pseudorhignaria spicata. So very classical scablands vegetation. And then in the background, of course, some ponderosa pine. Here's a good example of one of the plants that does well on a bare rock substrate, in this case on the Columbia River basalts through which we're hiking. This is rock mat buckwheat, Eriogonum heracloides, and it is a classic kind of rim rock dependent species. So if you're up where the rock protrudes through whatever soil you have, usually at the top of a slope or at the edge of a canyon especially, you're going to find some of these rock dwelling or rupicolous plants that really specialize in that sort of habitat. So rock mat buckwheat. So right here all along the edge we've got Sandberg's bluegrass, Poa sandbergii, which we've talked a lot about in class, but it has those little secant inflorescences, meaning they all turn to one side. As you can see that, all those inflorescences turn to one side. And they're beginning to sprout out here at the base. They're starting their spring growth. That's not focusing. There we go. Now I know you'd all be disappointed if we didn't get some Sophie into this video. There's some Sophie happily running down the old rail grade. Hey Sophie! She just wants to keep going. And of course, gotta get some Jill in the video. Do you have any words of wisdom for the class?
No.
No. Alright, back to Sophie. We need to work on our co-hosting skills. Beautiful out here. It's almost 55 degrees Fahrenheit out here, but on this little north-facing slope here along the trail, we still have an icicle. It's still freezing at night here. We've got some seep vegetation, including Chilanthus ferns up there, which are kind of dead right now, but they'll be back. But very much a mesic environment in the midst of a very hot one. And then as we look out into this big bowl here, carved out by the ancient floods, we've got kind of a deeper soil area along the river, and we have Douglas-fir joining the ponderosa pine. So there's a Douglas-fir right there. So here we have kind of an isolated instance of a mixed conifer forest out here in what is generally ponderosa pine woodland and channeled scabland prairie vegetation. So we go through a number of different environments modulated by topography, moisture availability, and effects on localized temperature regimes. So always keep that in mind. What kind of heat load are we experiencing in any given part of the terrain? You know, what kind of moisture is available in the soil? You know, how does that heat load modulate evapotranspiration stress in any given one part of the environment? These are all questions that help us understand the vegetation. And by the way, we've got some more of the mixed conifer zone shrubs like ocean spray right here with those spray-like inflorescences. And we also have a good bit of Physocarpus malvaceus. Obviously it's not in leaf yet, but that's our mallow 9 bark. So between our Holodiscus discolor ocean spray and our Physocarpus malvaceus mallow 9 bark, we've got a good representation of native shrubs that are more characteristic of the lower mixed conifer zone. In this view along the river, we see we've got a riparian forest or gallery forest of broadleaf trees. The dominant one there in terms of height is the black cottonwood, Populus balsamifera, or Populus trichocarpa subspecies balsamifera, depending upon who you ask. And then we've got a nice little gallery forest of hawthorn beneath it, Crataegus douglasii, which is a thorn-armed tall shrub to small tree, which can form dense thickets, as you can see. And then we have a non-native gold-twig willow right there. It provides habitat value for a number of organisms in the riparian corridor, various warblers and so forth. Songbirds are going to use structure like that, even if the willow is not necessarily native. And then, as we shift over here to the south-facing slope, we've got a very xeric ponderosa pine woodland with an understory of our blue bunch wheatgrass and Idaho fescue. And here, this is a stand that probably could be thinned out at some point, either by fire or by some selective timber harvest. Open it up to its more historic open condition, which is more resilient to climate change, to periodic fire, which should be kept on the ground level as a low severity fire, and to stressors like bark beetles, which will step in, as I noted, if you maintain too high a stocking of the pines. We're walking along under a cliff band here. The old rail grade is passing along these cliffs, and these cliffs are a specialized habitat for a number of plant species. I'm looking up there, I'm seeing blue bunch wheatgrass growing in little pockets of soil, sandberg bluegrass. You've got some shrubs growing up there as well. Our Physocarpus malvaceus is showing up there. You've got a number of specialized mosses, as you can see. And you've got some very specialized plants like smooth alum root, Heuchera micrantha. There's some right there. So it's a member of the saxifrage family, which is very specialized for cliff habitats. So hopefully that can focus a little bit. But a very beautiful little saxifrage, and a lot of saxifrages are adapted to rocky or steep or cliffy habitats. In fact, the name saxifrage means the rock breaker. So it's from the Latin saxifragere, meaning the rock breaker. And so yeah, they grow on these rocky cliffs, and they probably do help with root activity to destabilize the rocks a little bit. But think about other animals that might use these cliffs. Peregrine falcons or other raptors might use these as nesting habitat. You've also got wood rats, which will create little dens in crevices in the basalt rock, and you'll know a wood rat den because of a long string of whitish whitish excrement which kind of washes down from those. Haven't seen any of those yet, but definitely that is also an animal that avails itself of habitat among the steep rocks. So very specialized habitat, even though it obviously can't afford a great level of vegetative development because it's a soil limited environment. Here we are, we still have a number of ice stalactites here. They're slowly starting to melt off. You can see water moving underneath the ice. It's very beautiful. Very beautiful pattern. Little bubbles of air and water moving underneath the sheet of ice. A reminder that spring is on its way and summer is going to return shortly to this environment. Here we have a nice overlook of a very well developed stand of aspen. It's on the north facing side of the river, meaning the south side of the river, on some good deep bottomland soil that's accumulated at the valley bottom on the toe slope, and clearly it's not going to get direct summer radiation, so it's a relatively cooler, more mesic site, and the aspen here has grown very well. Now come summer, this is going to be a hot spot for neotropical migratory songbirds, and they're going to be eating the variety of insects that will be consuming parts of the aspen. Broadleaf stands have a disproportionate importance for these neotropical migratory songbirds because of the rich insect communities that they support. Also, these aspens and cottonwoods along the river are very good perching sites during the winter for bald eagles that are there to wait out the winter along these major creeks and rivers. They're feeding on the fish. They need a good roosting site for the sometime during the day or for the night, and the black cottonwoods and tall aspens are preferred sites for their roosting activities. So these really are very important environments for quite a lot of the biodiversity. Moose, deer, and elk also will come down and they will browse the sprouts of aspen in the understory. Also, they grow very quick, they form snags very quick, so for birds like wood ducks or members of the woodpecker alliance, they're going to be very important for formation of cavities for roosting and nesting activities. So this stand here is a very good example of one of those north-facing refugial environments. It probably always did have Douglas-fir, but it really wouldn't be here at this density. And we see a number of the Douglas-firs growing in underneath the ponderosa pine. And so really we've seen, even in these dense north-facing slope woodland stands, densification and increases in risk for catastrophic fire at some point. On this old Douglas-fir we have a fire scar, as you can see, going quite a ways up the stem. But this Douglas-fir is fairly old, probably 150 years or greater, and it would have probably been present here during historic times. Well, we know it was because of that fire scar. And then we've got a relatively dense understory of tall shrubs like the ocean spray. So that's probably what these refugial environments look like. A few Douglas-fir in different degrees of regeneration, and then a few large old trees that would survive from fire event to fire event. All right, here's the first rail tunnel. And in this deep, moist declivity here, artificial though it is, we have a real mesophyte, sword fern, Polystichum minitum. So it shows you what this cool, moist habitat here, artificially carved out of course, but it's still serving for some of the native biodiversity. All right, into the tunnel. I think I'm ready here. This was part of a rail system that once connected Western Washington with Chicago to facilitate export of agricultural goods to the Midwest. All right, there's one end of the tunnel, and there's the other end of the tunnel. Jill's the little dot of light down there, headed towards it. Just like at the end of the semester, you can see the light at the end of the tunnel. The grassy understory of this ponderosa pine Douglas-fir stand is Calamagrostis rubescens, red pine grass, which is very common throughout the West, especially under ponderosa pine. And you can see the characteristic smooth texture of that grass, with the blades basically lying flat along the forest floor. It'll be putting up new leaves here very shortly in the spring.
Better view.
Yeah. Well, here we are breaking out onto Rock Lake, which was excavated by those Pleistocene floods and now is a permanent lake, permanent natural lake. Off we go, down the rail bed. Here we've got some dark-eyed juncos foraging on the ground, out in the grass. A flock of them, they're flying among the trees, but then dropping down to the ground to feed on grass seeds and so forth. There's another dark-eyed junco. They'll also eat conifer seeds. They can substantially reduce the amount of conifer seeds on the ground in an area, actually altering conifer reproduction. Junco hymalis. We've got a flock of chickadees hanging out in this small pine up there in the foreground. We reached Rock Lake here. You can see those cliffs that have been carved out by the Pleistocene floods. It was J. Harlan Bretz, a geologist in the 1930s, who put forth the hypothesis that these big channeled areas in the Columbia Basin were created by Ice Age floods, and nobody accepted the idea. It wasn't until the 60s when geologists uniformly accepted his theory, long after the poor man had passed away. So some people to this day call them the Bretz floods, in honor of that pioneering geologist who put forth that particular hypothesis. Very meticulously, I might add. He was very careful about gathering evidence from across Washington state, including this area, to create an explanation for what had created these features. Whew. Getting a little warm here, even though there's still some ice and little patches of snow on the north-facing cliffs. And here we are passing by a stand of toe slope aspen, much more stunted than the valley bottom aspen. But nonetheless, there must be sufficient soil moisture in the spring and midsummer here at the toe of this talus slope to give aspen a foothold and sufficient water supply, thus making it a hotspot of biodiversity. And an interesting additional element to the tree flora here of the channel scablands. What do you think of this old trestle, Jill?
Sketchy.
Little sketch, kind of old. I don't think Sophie's going to be that excited about this. It's okay, Soph, we don't need to go down there. Can you imagine building this? They probably didn't have OSHA back then. Well, here it is, carved out by the Pleistocene outburst floods, originating from near Missoula, Montana, bursting out in a wave of water hundreds of feet high, 60, 70 miles an hour across the Columbia River Basin, carving out the layers of the relatively soft basalt rock. And that's why we have some of those little ledge features or bench features on the cross-sectional topography of the valley here. And those little benches have neat little remnants of prairie, and we'll see one of those as we go back here along the trail. Some of the early wildflowers like sagebrush buttercup and Douglas iris are beginning to bloom with the precious soil moisture that is still present this time of year in the soil. So here we are on one of those benches, which is really the top of one of the layers of the Columbia River basalt. So we're on top of one of the flows, and all the overlying basalt was stripped away during one of the Pleistocene floods. So we're really in a rather soil depth limited environment. And if you look uphill, you can see the adjacent remnants of some of the flows that once laid above this particular flow. And you can see they're still in the process of being fragmented. We have a talus slope, and that contributes to the presence of a little stand of aspen at the toe slope of that talus area. But here on this bench, we've got some native grasses. This is Idaho fescue. Now, the further north from Pullman that you come, up towards the Spokane area, the more Idaho fescue there is. It's a little higher, a little bit more within the 49th parallel jet stream, a little more moisture, and so Idaho fescue makes a bit more of a showing in places like this. We still have the blue bunch wheatgrass, which are the taller bunch grasses here behind me. But Idaho fescue, with its very fine little half-millimeter leaves and then its delicate little inflorescences, are very characteristic of this environment in which we find ourselves. And you can see the new flush of foliage coming out at the base of the bunch. Now, what else do we have here? We also have some of the rock mat buckwheat right here. That's the very silvery gray, low mat forming shrub right here, just on the other side of Sophie. And we also have some of the early spring perennial plants coming up, some of the perennial forbs. Douglas iris is one of my favorites. So if you just come on over here with me. Sophie, over here. There we go. Okay, so this is Douglas iris right here, Sisyrinchium douglasii. It's in the Iridaceae, the iris family, and it has delicate corms below ground that store photosynthate or energy from the previous year, and in the spring, just as growing conditions become right, it puts up a shoot and it flowers and sets seed very early. So it's a strategy for this relatively xeric summer arid environment. It gets everything done before the punishing heat of summer sets in. Here on this exposed small boulder of basalt, we have a characteristic collection of mosses and lichens and cyanobacteria, that biotic crust, and it's also present off of the rocks. If you look here under the bunchgrass clumps, we also have some mosses and lichens, cyanobacteria, and other organisms that comprise that very important biotic crust. Over here, for example, you can see those light green little trumpet-shaped organisms, and those are lichens, Cladonia lichens, and they're also an important part of that biotic crust. So very complex ecosystems. We've got the taller bunch grasses like the blue bunch wheatgrass. We've got the shorter bunch grasses like the Idaho fescue. We've got some shrubs or subshrubs like that rock mat buckwheat that you see right there. In the background, that reddish haze is some woods rose, Rosa woodsii. And then all the way down at ground level, we have our biotic crust. So very complex, multi-layered ecosystems. And in this particular location, we're lucky to have a site that has not been heavily invaded by cheatgrass or other invasive annual grasses. So a very good example of what a lot of our shrub steppe environment would have looked like historically. And last thing to mention right there, that silvery shrub is our Erichimera nauseosus. Very characteristic shrub of this part of the basin here. Rabbit brush, Erichimera nauseosus. I don't know why I forget some of those things sometimes, but I'm not going to reshoot that previous segment just for that. Rabbit brush, Erichimera nauseosus. Yeah. All right. Well, I guess it's time to head back to the vehicle. Head for Pullman. It's been a pretty good segment out here in the Channel Scablands with these deeply carved lakes, cliff sides, ponderosa pine woodlands, remnant prairie segments. Just a beautiful experience. Just another illustration of the beauty and complexity of our arid lands of eastern Washington. Sagebrush buttercup, Ranunculus glaberimus, is one of the early spring wildflowers out here in the in the arid lands. Usually it occurs in sagebrush steppe, but it can occur in landscapes that are not dominated by sagebrush. Like here we're in a ponderosa pine, chrysothemis or ericameria woodland. And yeah, here in the grassier, drier portions of that landscape, you can find some of these plant species that are more characteristic of the environments more to the west, in the drier heart of the Columbia Basin. This bench here is dominated by classic blue bunch wheatgrass, Pseudoregnarius spicata. You can see the clumpy texture of the grass cover. And where have the shrubs established? You can see that the shrubs here have established in among the boulders, where they presumably had a nice microsite, shaded microsite with a little more available water, cooler temperatures because of the shade, where they could establish. Probably the bouldery sites also limited grass competition, which is key to having those shrubs established in among the boulders versus out away from the boulders. You can see there's no shrub cover whatsoever. But when we move into the bouldery area right here, we've got, this is a ribes, a currant shrub right here, and a number of other shrub species are starting to leaf out. Probably yellow gooseberry or currant is this particular species. But yeah, geomorphic diversity leads to floristic diversity, as you can see in this example of the boulders providing an establishment microsite for a life form different than grasses. What'd you find there, Jill? Some of those sagebrush buttercups?
Yeah. The bees are in them.
And the bees are in there. Awesome.
Right here. It's really big and open.
Wow. Awesome. And the pollinators are already in there working them. Sweet. Good spot. And here among the Idaho fescue, you can see the wispy clumps of Idaho fescue. Awesome. Spring starts early here in the arid lands of eastern Washington. Into the darkness. Definitely a significant drop in temperature going into here. One of the reasons why cave entrances are ecologically important. They affect the microclimate just outside the cave entrance, like we saw with the sword fern earlier. Do you think Sophie's ready to go home? She is headed for the car with nary a glance back. She says, "Come on, just go." Well, I guess it's time to end this adventure out here in the beautiful Channel Scablands. Yep, well, I guess we should sign out, huh? Another excellent adventure somewhere in the American West. All right. See you soon.